everyone, and welcome back to my brother's commentary once again. Today we are going to be continuing the new U.S. Constitution series once again. This time, basically kind of going over the election/appointment requirements for both the President and the Chancellor. So, without further ado, let's get started. So essentially, I'm going to go over the requirements for both executive officers first. I don't know, just to kind of get that out of the way, because there are some shared requirements. And then I'm probably going to go over the president next, mostly because that one is going to be a lot more complicated, but also maybe somewhat familiar for a lot of people. And then I'll probably just do the chancellor last. So basically, for both executive officers, you have to be either a native-born U.S. citizen or a naturalized citizen with at least 20 years of U.S. citizenship, similar to the Arnold Amendment that was proposed, I want to say like back in the early 2000s. And then be at least 35 years of age, have lived in the U.S. for 14 years. No one can serve in both executive offices at the same time. Parties can only nominate a max of 4 candidates for either office, or 8 total candidates. Essentially, basically, candidates can only serve a max of 12 years as an executive officer if they desire to serve in both offices. I mean, which odds are they probably will. And both executive officers must be inaugurated into office on the 3rd Friday of January, kind of similar to what we do now. And so that doesn't really change. Basically, a candidate who has been elected to the presidency is basically called a president-elect, while a candidate who has been appointed to become chancellor is basically a chancellor-designate. And if a chancellor wants to run for election as a president, and or vice versa, they must wait at least 3 years before their final term in their current offices has ended. Just to basically, I don't know, I guess limit the potential for political corruption, if you will. That's kind of the main intent that I have for that particular clause. Now, as far as the president goes, there's basically going to be a 3-round system, if you will. The Electoral College is still in play, but they don't necessarily come around until the 3rd round, essentially. But I'm going to go over basically everything anyway. So essentially, the Electoral College is still the small collection. Is basically still a collection of appointed representatives from each state or territory that essentially elect the president. I mean, that doesn't change. However, I do go a little further with regards to the requirements for the Electoral College. So basically, they have to be a U.S. citizen, at least 35 years of age, a resident of the state they are chosen to represent, be able to read any national language, while, I mean, those are the main requirements, that all of them, but they also have to meet any combination of the following requirements that I'm going to list. So basically, be serving in a state or local legislature, have a bachelor's degree in political science and or a master's degree in constitutional law, have served as an official political employee of a governmental entity and or political party for at least 3 years, having volunteered as an official, i.e. registered party activist for at least 5 years, like maybe working on a campaign or something, or having served in the federal military as an enlisted service member, which does include non-commissioned officers, with at least 4 total years of service. However, basically Mustang officers as well as warrant officers with prior enlisted experience. I mean, commissioned officers with prior enlisted experience, for those who don't know, are called Mustangs. So that's why I said that. So essentially, like any commissioned or warrant officer that basically has prior enlisted service will also be allowed to participate in the Electoral College. And the reason why I did that is because I feel like essentially the president is basically going to be dealing with foreign affairs and military pretty much solely in this system. So I guess it just makes more sense to allow people who have actually served in the military to actually to basically be a part of the process of electing the president. I mean, that's just my personal opinion. You may differ, but essentially that's basically the Electoral College. Essentially, the first round is basically going to be state or territory-wide open list proportional representation primaries, in which a max of 4 candidates from each party will compete against each other for the party's nomination in the year of the presidential election. So essentially, there's basically 4 super regions. I'm not necessarily going to list every single state and every region, but basically, it's just going to be like East, South, Midwest, and West. I'll have a map up here for you. Just just kind of help. Just to kind of explain things a little bit better. Essentially, in each state in these primaries basically have twice the number of electoral college votes that they would normally have. And the formula for that is, for electoral college votes, is basically still the same. It's basically the number of House seats plus the number of Senate seats. I mean, that doesn't change from the current system. With territories, like the District of Columbia, as well as Guam and Puerto Rico, I mean, they're also going to be allowed to vote in presidential elections now. And they basically have the same number of votes as the least populous state. So that's relatively new. I mean, so essentially, basically, the candidate that basically gets the most amount of votes in the primaries and all the primaries for all the states and territories, they will essentially win the nomination to basically go on to the next round. Instead of having the traditional conventions that we normally do. And people can only vote for one candidate regardless of party, so that doesn't necessarily... I mean, that's basically just to kind of eliminate... basically just voter fraud, if you will. Yeah, so basically the second round is kind of what we are what we have now, where basically we essentially just kind of elect the members of the electoral college via, I don't know. I mean, it's essentially kind of what we have now, like what we have like during November, essentially. And instead of basically having a winner-take-all system like we currently have for most states, they're all going to be proportional representation, closed list proportional representation. And essentially, basically all states with at least 10 votes or less. I mean, basically, states with 10 votes or less are basically going to have a minimum 3% threshold, whereas states with at least 11 votes are basically going to have a minimum of a 2% threshold to basically receive electoral college votes. There's going to be no more than one inter-party debate in August, September, and October after the primaries. And essentially, yeah, that's basically kind of round 2, essentially. Now, round 3 is basically going to be a ranked choice system. And essentially what I'm saying here is, instead of giving the electoral college members one vote, they're basically going to be required to use ranked choice voting to essentially vote for the president, similar to what we kind of had prior to the 12th Amendment, where basically you basically had 2 votes for president, and at least 1 vote essentially had to be for someone outside of your state. Whereas in my system, you basically have to rank all the candidates just based on how you like them, essentially. With essentially the party that you're representing being anywhere in the top 3. I mean, that's basically the only requirement that the electoral college members have to meet when it comes to voting. Otherwise, they can basically vote and they can rank candidates however they choose. And essentially, I mean, as long as you win a simple majority, I mean, you're basically going to become the president. However, the ranked choice voting process, my apologies, basically continues for no more than 3 rounds or until one candidate basically reaches the threshold. Otherwise, if the electoral college fails to elect a president within 3 rounds, the election will basically go to the Senate. And they will essentially have 14 days to elect the president. And if they fail to do so, then basically people will directly elect the president themselves in another election, if that makes sense. Essentially, the electors are basically going to meet in either A, the office of the Secretary of State, the office of the governor or lieutenant governor, C, any room in the state capitol building, or D, the office of the director of elections, or any other place that's basically designated by the director. And essentially, basically, the chancellor and the chairperson of the Constitutional Council will essentially preside over the counting and presentation of the votes for from the Electoral College. And the ballots will basically be immediately transferred to the chancellor and the chairperson, of course. The state secretary of state, the National Archives and Records Administration, or any federal equivalent of it, as well as the presiding judge in the district where the electors meet. So that's essentially the process there. And the president will only serve a max. Well, they will only serve one 6-year term and cannot be reelected. And that's really just to kind of give the president at least a little bit more time to kind of like enact their agenda, while also just hopefully limiting potential corruption, if you will. And again, I'll basically put up another picture here just to kind of like help kind of like explain the whole process of what's really going on, of like the new system now. But essentially, yeah, that's basically how the president gets elected in this new system. Now, the chancellor is basically going to be appointed by the president and approved by a single majority in the House of Representatives. However, this is basically going to be, states are not necessarily going to, representatives are not necessarily going to basically kind of like vote for, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Essentially, voting is going to be via en bloc, with each state basically having one vote, no matter how many representatives they have. And territories don't necessarily, like territories that are not recognized as states, like the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc., they have no say in this process whatsoever. But essentially, but for states that essentially have like two votes, like one or two votes, they will basically form kind of like their own block as well. And they will, essentially, they are basically just kind of like, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is they're basically their own little group, and whoever gets a single majority of votes within each, like whoever gets a single majority vote in each group will basically have their vote cast for their candidate of chancellor. Now, essentially the vote is, the vote for the chancellor will be done by secret ballot, and that's basically just hopefully to kind of ensure that the chancellor's majority does not necessarily depend on members of his or her party who might be internally opposed to them, but need to publicly express support, if you will. Now, and that's basically it. Now, chancellors are basically going to be they're only able to serve a max of 3 2-year terms and cannot be reappointed. Now, essentially with that, that's basically it for the chancellor. The deputy executive officers, on the other hand, basically the vice president and deputy chancellor, they are essentially optional honorary titles that don't necessarily have any political power unless the president and or chancellor die, resign, or otherwise removed from office. So basically they have to fulfill the same requirements as the president and chancellor respectively, and essentially they can only be like a former candidate that ran in the previous election, an appointed member of the Senate, or an elected member of the House. So basically, like, if you're running for vice president, you have to be in the Senate, whereas you're running for deputy chancellor, you have to be in the House. Or you can be a member of the domestic cabinet for the deputy chancellor, or the foreign cabinet for vice president. Basically, they also receive no paid salary for their title, and they also may participate in various ceremonial functions at the request of the president. And essentially, the biggest difference in this system is that being a vice president or deputy chancellor technically last as long as the president or chancellor who appointed them respectively is still in office. And they can technically serve under multiple presidents or chancellors. So there's really technically no term limit for them, considering that they don't really have much political power. It's really just kind of like a placeholder just in case something happens, really, more than anything. So essentially, yeah, I mean, that's the gist of the system that I have in place right now. So the next episode on this series is basically going to be detailing the powers of the executive officers. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like or a comment down below. Do all the YouTube things. It really does help this channel out. So until next time, Night Brothers Commentary, signing out.